People don't understand that disability people, they have to live in places that are very, very dangerous. Nobody should have to live like that.
Bethesda Cornerstone Village in Victoria is the first in the country where we're actually integrating people that are age 55 years and older with people with intellectual developmental disabilities. Not only are we inclusive, but we have activities and programming that bring both populations together in one setting that creates that community, which is so critical and so important.
Bethesda has group homes all over the United States. What we've found is that the government has changed the way that they're funding group homes and individuals with disabilities. Bethesda had to come up with a new plan on how they can come up with funding for their people with disabilities.
Here in Bethesda Cornerstone Village in Victoria, 20% of the units are set aside for individuals with an intellectual developmental disability. And those individuals really are receiving rent subsidies equivalent to 50% of the county median income. We provide subsidies through other sources, such as help from real estate tax abatement from the City of Victoria. And then we have a philanthropy department that also provides help and assistance to these individuals. Cornerstone Village, in our transformation, really takes it to the next step.
It is really important that we have a strong community here. So one of my main jobs is to create this community, create activities and events and classes for all of the residents. All of our activities are for everybody here at Cornerstone. This way we can integrate the seniors with the people with disabilities.
What that does is that really lifts people up that have a disability to be as independent as possible. And that's the goal. Independence is really quality of life. Bethesda Lutheran Communities is a recognized service organization within the LCMS, as well as LCEF. We've really cultivated and thought of different ways of how LCEF could be a part of this initiative. And one of the ways is to participate in providing us financing for this development. The core values of LCEF and Bethesda are identical. We all are here serving the kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus. When you have that common value, the opportunities are limitless. Bethesda Cornerstone Village in Victoria here is our first housing community that we've created, but it's certainly not the last.
I think we joked one time that wouldn't it be great if when it was done, could live here? It'd just be like a dream of mine. And here I am, living at Cornerstone Village. Just the most amazing thing I've ever experienced.
So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Kurt Sinski. He is the founder and principal of CEO Board Services, which is a consulting firm that specializes in working with mission-oriented organizational leaders and boards around issues of governance, strategy, organizational structure, succession planning, coaching, and mergers and acquisitions. For the past 23 years, Dr. Kurt Sinski has served as the Chief Executive Officer of Upbring, which is formerly known as Lutheran Social Services of the South, a multifaceted, multi-state social service agency with an annual operating budget of over $100 million and 1,000 employees. At Upbring, Dr. Sinski has been responsible for more than quadrupling the size of the agency and steering the once troubled agency back to financial strength. During his tenure, the organization eliminated an indebtedness of $60 million and currently enjoys an endowment of over $40 million. Dr. Sinski completed his undergraduate work at Concordia University, Texas, and Valparaiso University, Indiana, majoring in accounting with a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration. He holds a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Illinois College of Law, a Master of Arts degree in International Relations from Schiller International University in Paris, France, and a PhD in Government from the University of Texas at Austin. Prior to his work at Upbring, Dr. Sinski served as an assistant to the president at Concordia University, Texas. Dr. Sinski also practiced law in Chicago, Illinois, with several firms, including the firm of Henshaw and Culbertson. In addition, he has served as a senior staff member and policy advisor for government leaders at local, state, and national levels for both the Republican and Democrat parties. Dr. Sinski is the author of 4 books: Wine and the Word, Savor and Serve, The Calling, Live a Life of Significance, Executive Values, A Christian Approach to Organizational Leadership, and Personal Values. His forthcoming book is tentatively titled The CEO and the Board, The Art of Governance as a Competitive Advantage, which is also the title of his presentation. As a gifted public speaker, Dr. Sinski has also been a guest columnist on a variety of issues for newspapers and magazines, as well as a regular commentator on television and radio. Dr. Sinski and his wife Laura live in Austin, Texas, and are the proud parents of their daughters, Sydney and son-in-law, Cody. Please welcome Dr. Kurt Sinski.
Rahima, thank you very much. As I like to say, it's one of those introductions that my wife would enjoy and my mother would actually believe. So I appreciate that. It's exciting for me to be here today. And I'm one of these weird guys that actually loves the topic of governance. And I know we're probably not going to cover everything today because of our limited time. And I also want to make sure we do have time together to talk and to answer any questions that you might have. But my goal for the end of this webinar today is that I want each of you, whether you're executive director, CEO, board member, to think about specific strategies of how you can enhance your governance model, your governance practice, so that, sometimes it's a distraction. So it's no longer a distraction or a burden or maybe less of a disadvantage, but rather becomes this competitive advantage that allows you as an organization to become more efficient and effective. So the research that I've done in working on this book that's close to being done is that there are really 2 things that the research is clear about. One is a healthy board CEO relationship. And you couple that then with an effective governance model that has been proven to provide each organization with a competitive advantage. So what I'm going to do today is unpack that a little bit. So maybe, Raymond, let's go to the next board slide. One more, maybe. And the question becomes, I think, why would, for those of you who don't know me, and even for those of you who do, why would you listen to me, right? So as Rahima mentioned, I've spent 23 years as a CEO. I've served on 11 different boards, including the LCMS Board of Directors, LCMS Human Care, World Relief, Thrive and Charitable, Lutheran Hour Ministries. And so I'm one of these weird guys who's actually probably sat in between consulting and board member and a CEO over 1,000 board meetings. And so it's been interesting from my perspective to see it from all sides. And I think that's helped in terms of really understanding some of the challenges that you as executive directors, CEOs face, as well as the challenges that board members face as they truly want to make a difference on the boards that they serve, but sometimes don't necessarily know how. So we'll start with a little humor. I absolutely love this quote by Mark Twain. I'm not sure why he was thinking about board of directors, but God made idiots. That was for practice, and he made boards. A little bit of overkill, but it's funny, right? The second quote that I have is a little bit more serious by people, everybody knows Peter Drucker, but he was convinced that most boards don't function. And, why wouldn't necessarily go that far? I think there are opportunities for every board and every relationship between the CEO and the board to improve. And then the last quote by John Carver, famous for the Carver model in terms of board governance. Board members are usually intelligent and experienced and really good people. but sometimes when we get together as groups, we become mediocre, right? And so he was convinced that oftentimes boards tend to be incompetent groups of competent individuals. Again, it's probably a little bit of an overkill, but I think the point is that both very talented executive directors, very committed and talented board members, they want to make a difference. They want to have a societal impact with respect to the organization which they serve. But oftentimes, whether it's the CEO after a board meeting or board members after a year or two of serving on the board, they go away frustrated, saying, I really don't feel like my talents are being used as well as maybe they could be. So that's really what this conversation today that we're going to have is all about. So I'm a big believer that governance is both an art and a science, and also that there is no one size governance model that fits each and every organization. A lot of people use the Carver model. I'm a believer that aspects of the Carver model work really well for many organizations. The for-profit world is now using a lot what came from the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation. But when you think about governance, think about it in terms of two pieces. One is the science of it, and this is important, right? It's, fulfilling our fiduciary responsibilities, our duty of care, our duty of loyalty. It's having the right audit committee members. It's having maybe a governance committee or a personnel committee. It's ensuring that we take good care of our assets. It's ensuring that maybe we have a succession plan and we hire the right executive director. All of those pieces are the science of getting governance. And it's important, and oftentimes there are ways to improve that. But I would also suggest that that's not where an executive director or a board should stop, because so much about governance is also the art. It's the art of creating an environment so that good strategic planning can occur. It's the art of understanding that maybe our bylaws and articles that made sense 50 years ago no longer quite fit today's environment. It's the opportunity to really get together as an organization, as board members and the CEO, to come together and to figure out a way how to be as efficient and effective as possible. That's the art of it. A lot of that includes emotional intelligence, emotional maturity. It comes, with the idea that a CEO should not have any surprises or any secrets with the board. It's sharing, it's honesty, it's truth, it's integrity. But that piece is the art of it. And what I found in a lot of the research is that's where a number of organizations maybe are currently lacking. And we're going to unpack just a few of those today to give you a sense of what I mean by that. So another way of talking about the art and science, and I mentioned this earlier, is the idea that not only do you need an effective board governance structure, so what's the right number of board members to be on your board? What type of people do you want to have sitting around the table? But it's also this idea that a governance model is not static. And for an organization to continue to evolve, an organization continue to reinvent itself and to be successful, it also, as a board and CEO, you need to continually adjust your governance model to reflect both the changing internal and external realities. So, maybe a couple of examples of this. Back before the Thrivent merger, Lutheran Brotherhood elected all of its board members in a convention of its members. And so what would happen is that the various board candidates would get up, give a speech, and then the members would vote to determine who they wanted on the board for the next 3 years. Well, as you can kind of imagine, the accountants and the actuaries of the world were probably less competent at giving motivational speeches than maybe others with other skill sets. And so, for example, at one of the conventions in the 90s, what happened was every single accountant and investment person got voted out of office, and people with no investment and accounting experience got voted in. And so obviously, for someone who Fortune 500 organization, you can't have that, right? And so after the merger, Thrivent and AL and LB wisely changed their bylaws and their articles to allow for a more selective selection of board members. When I became CEO at Lutheran Social Services of the South, many of our, if not most of our board members were selected by the district board of directors as well as the Synod councils. Now, they were well-meaning people who had our best interests at heart, but having 5 different organizations select our board members meant that there really wasn't any connection between the organizations in terms of determining what sorts of skill sets we needed to sit around that table. It was just a clunky, burdensome process where everybody was well-meaning, but in practice, it didn't quite work the way we wanted it to. And so we switched it, and we talked to the different district presidents and said, this is our issue. This is what we'd like to propose. We don't want to lose our stakeholder relationship with you, but are there different ways that we could accomplish this? And obviously they said absolutely yes. And so it became a much more efficient way, an effective way for us to have the right people around the table. Maybe one last example. I work with a board that, while the bylaws allow the CEO to be a female, of course, because this was an organization that began 120 years ago, there was still one of those bylaws that was stuck in the governance documents that said a female could not be a board chair. They could be board members, but they couldn't be board chair. Now, obviously, with this organization where most of their donors were females, probably not a good idea, right? But it's an example of there's all sorts of historical legacies within pretty much every organization that's more than 10 or 20 years old, that if you don't proactively address, it can actually be inefficient within your ability to run an organization. So this is probably the area where I hear the most complaints from both the executive director, CEO, as well as from board members. And, you know, I think if you look at it from the perspective of the CEO, oftentimes it's really difficult these days to find the right board members, right? And so you find yourself spending a lot of time recruiting board members, trying to get the right mix around the table. And if you were like me, and I'm not proud of this, but if you were like me, you would oftentimes maybe minimize the responsibility of a board member just to get them to say yes. So, you know, I would say, you know, we meet 4 times a year. We have a policy-based governance model. We do all of our committee work by telephone. It's not going to take a whole lot of your time, but we really think this is why you're important to our board, and these are the reasons. Well, the reality is that board participation, board involvement today is probably more complex than ever. You know, there are technology issues, there's COVID issues, there are financial issues, there's the external environment and internal environments changing pretty rapidly these days. And to minimize a board member's involvement is probably not the right way to go either. From a board member's perspective, oftentimes what they would say is, you know, I really wanted to have hands-on involvement with this board, but I'm realizing that the CEO really doesn't want me to provide any advice. He just wants me to rubber stamp everything that he or she does. And I'm here to make a difference. And so there's oftentimes that disconnect. And what I talk to people about, whether it's the board or the executive director, is I think there are several steps in this process. One is, as you recruit you talented and appropriate board members, think about several things. One is, do they really have the time? Be honest up front with what their responsibilities are. Be honest with whether or not you are a pure policy-based governance model, or if you're more hands-on. Be honest in terms of what their responsibilities are and the requirements are. And so and then through board orientation, just to ensure that there isn't necessarily a disconnect between you and what their expectations are. Now, it's okay to, either be a hands-on board or a policy board, but one of the conversations that I think is helpful for board members to have, both individually with the CEO as well as collectively within the group, is to talk about which one they are. So in one board that I served on, we talked about whether or not we wanted to be a pilot board or a watchdog board. And so, watchdog board is more of a policy-based piece, and a pilot board would be more leading the organization. And initially we said, we want to be involved in strategy. We want to be a pilot board. So the CEO reluctantly agreed, okay, let's do this. But what we quickly learned as a board is that we simply didn't have enough understanding of the intricacies as well as the financial levers of what drove the organization forward to really make good decisions and to be of help from that strategic perspective for the CEO. And so we quickly, probably to the CEO's relief, became a policy-based watchdog board again. And so that's part of those conversations. The other part of the conversation, though, that I think helps, especially on the policy-based governance side, is to ensure that your board meetings and your calendars are set up so that board members do have enough time to feel like they are actively participating in the strategic side of an organization. So, oftentimes we get into this rut as CEOs where we present information to the board, but most of it's past information. And so they don't really feel like they're looking forward. They don't really feel like they're adding any value to the conversation. In the Lutheran Hour Ministries board, as well as the Thrive and Charitable board, what we've decided to do in terms of structure is a couple of things. One is we ensure that at every meeting, at least 50% of the time is devoted to looking forward. And at 2 of the 4 meetings, we come in a day earlier and at least have a day and a half where we can have some sort of strategic retreat where a senior staff person or a consultant will come in and do a deep dive on 1 or 2 or 3 really important issues to the organization, and then possibly divide the board members into small groups, but allow them in one format or the other to have the conversation, to have the ability to contribute strategically, that then the CEO and the senior staff can take back to their conversations and say, all right, maybe this person had a point. Let's talk about this. Because what I share with board members is, even though you may not feel it at the time of the board meeting, it's fascinating to me is how much senior staff and the CEO do listen to board members and take their thoughts and perspectives into account. And typically, from a positive perspective, adjust the strategy, even if it's on the edges, because this was some good advice coming forward. Another thing that we've done is, instead of having the CEO stand up front and in a podium, and it's kind of a us versus them type feel within the boardroom, is we oftentimes will have 2 or 3 or 4 of the top leaders of the organization, including the CEO, just sit around the conference table, where it's more of a dialogue around the 10 or 12 individuals, as opposed to feeling like it's a presentation format. And that helps too, in terms of just naturally allowing the flow of conversation to occur. The other question that comes up is, what is the right size of a board? And I think partly it depends on each situation of your particular board and organization. But I am seeing that there is a trend maybe to have a smaller board as opposed to larger boards. So those that used to be 20 are now maybe moving to 8 to 12. And the benefits of that is there's this psychological term called social loafing. What happens in larger boards is oftentimes board members feel, well, there's other people that are going to pick up the slack, so I probably don't have to be as involved in this particular season of the board, because other people will do it for me. If you have a smaller board, it's much harder for a board member to quote social loaf. And so it gets them and forces them to be more involved. Now, obviously you need to have enough people to populate the audit committee and the governance committee, et cetera. But I happen to serve on the board of, it's called ACTS Network here in Central Texas. And our mission, it's a 501c3, but our mission is to plant LCMS churches within Central Texas. And because we're a relatively small, young startup, we only have 4 board members, plus the kind of part-time executive director. And that's enough for us to sit around the table and to strategize in terms of how do we, serve and to support churches who want to expand. All right, let's see. So as I kind of alluded to earlier, it's interesting to me that it really doesn't matter what your organization is. Over time, the legal structure, whether it's your articles and bylaws, how it selects your board members, your internal policies, your policy manual, if you have a written manual, many times, while they made sense at the time they were created, they no longer necessarily make sense. I worked with a board that had literally a 200-page written policy manual that dictated not only the relationship between the CEO and the board, but also among the board members itself. And the reason it came to being, I learned 10, 15 years ago, is back in the day, not anymore, but back in the day, they didn't trust each other. And so what they did is they put everything in writing so that nobody could go beyond what their requirements were. So as this board became healthier and healthier, it became very clear to us that this is overkill and that we might be at a competitive disadvantage because our hands are tied seemingly at every turn. And so maybe what we need to do is take a fresh look at the policy manual and say, all right, what are the true rules and policies that we want to put into place and which are no longer needed because there is a healthy atmosphere. Another example, Lutheran Hour Ministries, as an example, we just changed our bylaws last year because up until last year, all of our board members were elected by the membership through electoral vote. It's just been the history of Lutheran Hour Ministries. And it's a wonderful process, and it allows the donors and the members of Lutheran Hour Ministries to become very involved in the governance piece. But we also, as a board, found that we probably, in addition to this, because we weren't ready to give that aspect up, let's also change the bylaws so that we're allowed to appoint 3 or 4 board members in case there is a need for us to have a skill set that we currently don't have. The LCMS Board of Directors in a recent convention did the exact same thing. I'm not sure we've used it yet, but if there were come a time when there was a need for a skill set in a board member and we didn't have it, this allows the board the opportunity to do that. Another board I worked with the bylaws required that the audit be done in 30 days after the end of the fiscal year. It's almost impossible to do. The auditor said, we can't do this. We are always out of compliance with the audit with this particular bylaw. So of course we changed that. Every board has some sort of I call it elephant in the room. It may be a minor elephant, but it's at a minimum an inefficiency that prevents you from being the most effective organization that you can be. And so my recommendation always is, be proactive as a board, be proactive as a CEO in recommending to the board, here are some bylaws and articles that just no longer make sense. Let's put together a subcommittee and work through this. Let's figure out if we can modernize it so that we can become more effective as an organization. So what's also interesting to me, and sometimes board members have a little bit of a hard time with this, but there are seasons within a board responsibility where you're going to be more involved than other seasons when you're not. There are certain times when the organization in some ways is clicking on virtually all cylinders. And it's really then the responsibility of the board to in some ways take a hands-off approach, let it just run, but also then ensure that the science of the governance piece continues to get performed. You know, the audit committee, the governance committee, that, you know, do we have the appropriate metrics to properly measure the CEO and the team to ensure that they actually are doing as good as we think they're doing? Do we continue to talk about succession planning? But it sometimes feels to board members that, you know, I'm not really fulfilling my responsibility. And so I don't feel like I'm making a difference. And so there's this tendency sometimes to try to get more involved, which isn't always helpful to the organization, let alone the CEO, right? So as a board member, there are going to be times when you're going to have to lean in. You're going to be all hands on, right? The CEO search, merger activity, talking about maybe a situation where your financial engine of the past is no longer going to be your financial engine of the future. COVID, when all of a sudden things had to change, especially those of you in the healthcare industry. Your world changed overnight, and you probably needed to bring your board along to help you make some really good decisions. You know, as a board member, if I see 2 or 3 key staff departing around the same time, I want to lean in a little bit to determine why, right? Boards in times of crisis need to lean in, but I would also suggest that there are also times when it's maybe in the CEO's interest for you to lean out a little bit as well, assuming you've also fulfilled all of your responsibilities. And it's an art. I can think of an organization where they had a longtime executive director and the board got complacent and they missed a number of signals that they should have caught that this organization was not in good financial shape. He retired, the new executive director came in, and all of a sudden they realized that they had a mess on their hands. And they brought in new board members, they brought in some new talent at the senior level, but it was too late for them to save that organization. And that organization no longer exists today. And part of it probably is on the shoulders of the president, but also a lot of it is on the shoulders of the board of directors who simply were asleep at the wheel. And so it is an art. It's both an art and a science. All right. So this is probably a lesson maybe I learned a little bit too late in my career, but better late than never, right? What I have found is that oftentimes, even organizations that seem to be doing well aren't necessarily as focused as they could be, both between the board and the CEO and also among the staff in general, about what is their very focused purpose and mission. And the more experience I got, the more I realized how important this was to each and every organization, whether you're a board member or a CEO. You know, the question is, what are you as an organization? What can you be the best at? What societal impact do you as an organization want to make? And once you get clarity on this, it then allows you to more easily say no to everything that gets thrown your way. I like to call those hobbies. We all want to do good. We all want to pursue hobbies and to help society. But sometimes there are other organizations that might be better at that than we are. And we need to, acknowledge those brutal, hard facts. So an example, about, 8-9 years ago, the mission at Lutheran Social Services of the South was we provide help, healing, and hope to the children, elderly, and the poor in the name of Jesus Christ. I always liked that mission. I thought that was a great mission statement. We have programs in children, we had programs elderly, we had programs for the poor, we had disaster response. Obviously, we were doing all of this in the name of Jesus Christ. One day I was having a meeting with one of our social media people, and he was helping me get some language. He wanted some language so that we could post some things on social media. And he was a millennial, mid-level employee. And he commented to me after I suggested, well, why don't we use our mission statement? He says, well, I don't really like our mission statement. It doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know what it means. And I thought, that's interesting. I said, well, what do you think the mission of our organization should be? And he says, you know what I'd really like to do, and one of the reasons I came to this organization is, you're the largest provider of children's services in Texas. I see so many issues out there. I want to end the cycle of child abuse here in Texas. That's what I want to do. That's my mission. That's why I'm here in Texas at Lutheran Social Services. I found that to be an interesting conversation. I shared that with some of my other staff members. It came up again at our strategic retreat. And long story short, we all got excited about this as well. And we became very focused. And so the question became, all right, if we are truly serious in 5 years to make a dent in breaking the cycle of child abuse here in Texas, what do we need to do? And so it caused all sorts of other conversations, right? Do we need to sell our retirement communities to create a war chest? We had 4 retirement communities that were doing well, but we also realized we were a very small fish in a very large pond, and that was probably going to be to our detriment in the future. We also knew that we had to have a stronger advocacy group. We had to do a better job at lobbying. We had to maybe change our brand, because if we're serious about inviting everybody to break the cycle of child abuse, while we're very proud and continue to have strong Lutheran roots and continue to be an RSO, is the brand in a state where almost 1%, only 1% of the population is Lutheran, getting in the way? So by having that focused mission, having a very clear purpose, it allows you to make some pretty difficult decisions, and it allows you to get really focused on what you do and don't need to do. So one of the things that I like to do with organizations I work with is say, all right, what is the one thing you want to accomplish in 5 years? 5 years, though, is a long time, right? So then let's work backwards. To accomplish that in 5 years, what are the 3 things you need to accomplish in 3 years? And then 3 years is still pretty long, especially for employees who want to make a difference today, to know we're on the right track. What is that one big thing we need to accomplish in 12 months? And then what are the 4 things we need to accomplish in 90 days to keep the momentum going? So it's a very simple, but I think an effective way to get down to brass tacks. Obviously, there's all sorts of other things you're going to need to do to keep your organization running and keep the trains running on time. But if you're truly intent on having that very focused mission and purpose, it helps to have just some of those simple goals in order to keep you that focus. So there's a McKinsey study, the consulting firm, that they found very clearly in their research that companies with diverse boards of directors had a much better outcomes than those with a homogeneous board of directors. There's other research that's coming out now too, saying that an organization that does a better job of infusing diversity throughout all levels of the organization is going to be a more effective organization than those who don't. And what do I mean by diversity? So diversity to me means bringing in all its forms, right? And it's bringing people with different perspectives at the table so that you can make better decisions. So, it could be ethnicity, it could be gender, but also it's technology. So as your organizations get more sophisticated from a technology perspective, you're going to want to have younger individuals on your board that truly get the technology side of it, as opposed to some of us who we call our immigrants. So it's our second language. It's not our first language, like maybe a younger generation. We want to have people maybe with an engineering background, or someone who has a skill set as a CEO that can be in some ways a counselor or advisor to the executive director. What I found at Upbring was that, especially during the Trump administration, is that it was really important for us to have around the table both Republicans and Democrats, because we had a couple of programs that served undocumented minors along the border, and amazing programs that literally served the least of these. But as you can recall, it also got to be a political question. And the Democrats that sat around our board first meeting had a different perspective of what was happening than the Republicans who were Trump supporters that sat around. And it was really important for us to have that engaged conversation among all of us, so that at the end of the day, because we're all Christians sitting around this table, wanting to serve the least of these, we can come to good decisions that will be of benefit to our constituencies as well as to our the organization as a whole. It's also why sometimes foundations or social service organizations will have maybe a fundee or a client as a board member at the table. I've seen that work in some situations. I've seen it not work as well as they had hoped in other situations. But it's the idea of getting different perspectives, not only around the board table, but also around your senior leadership and other avenues throughout your organization. What's also interesting is you just can't, what I've seen not work is for people to check off a box saying, all right, we now have one African-American, we now have 3 women. We've done a pretty good job of diversity, especially because we're a Lutheran organization. And in my particular community, we just don't have a lot of ethnic minorities. If that's part of it, if that's the perspective, it's probably not going to have much of an impact in your organization. And it's probably going to make some of the board members that you bring on feeling frustrated because they're not truly making a difference. So in order for this to work, it really has to be a mindset throughout the organization. I've actually seen an organization where the audit committee has gotten involved, where they say, all right, if we're serious about this, we need to look at who our vendors are, and we need to make sure that there's minority representation among our vendors to our organization. I've seen an investment committee do the same thing with its investment managers. Those are important things, but it's also important to remember that if you're going to go down this road, oftentimes the culture has to change, right? So there was a board that finally got this hotshot young technology startup guy who's very successful on their board of directors. And he came to his first meeting in his jeans and t-shirt and realized everybody was in suits and ties. And so there was a little bit of a disconnect that way, right? He was one of the few that didn't happen to be Lutheran. And when the board chair says, let's break for lunch and say the common table prayer, he had no idea what they were talking about. I've also seen, people who don't play golf get frustrated because the CEO only takes people who play golf out with him. There are cultural things that also have to be noticed and paid attention to for us to truly get the benefit of diversity, which are huge benefits within your organization. So we are all in this together, and sometimes I know it doesn't feel like it between the board and the CEO. And but what I have found is that, I think one of the advantages that we have as Christians is that we all come to the table with our commonality of faith. And so we come from a common perspective. And so it's a question of, all right, how do we bring all of us together in order to make that societal impact that we want to make? And I think there are some ways as CEO and executive director that have been at least helpful to me and others that I've coached. And one is that if you're just seeing your board members on a quarterly basis at your board meetings, that's probably not enough to build a relationship. And so for this to truly work, for truly to be one team, you probably are going to need to, have dinners, have lunch, have breakfast with each and every board member on an occasional basis. Most CEOs that I know now call each board member individually between quarterly board meetings because one, it allows them to figure out what's important to the board member. It allows also the CEO to have one-on-one time to talk about some of the issues facing her or him. It's also it allows the board member who may not necessarily feel comfortable talking about an issue at a board meeting to talk about it privately with that executive director. It's also probably important to have dinners and other social engagements and events now that COVID's hopefully almost over among board members so that they get to know each other in settings that are different than maybe in the board meeting. What I like to tell boards is that, yes, technically and legally, you are the executive director's boss. But the reality also is that 90 to 95% of the time, this is going to be a true partnership. And so look at it more as the partnership role, knowing that, there may be times when you're going to have to let the executive director know that he or she may no longer have the right skill sets. That happens on occasion, but mostly it doesn't. And mostly it's, all right, let's figure out how we can improve the executive director skill sets. Let's have the executive director figure out how the board can become more efficient and effective. Let's get to know each other on a professional and personal basis so that we can all come together for the common good. And that's the art of all of this, right? And it's important. And so if you have this trust and integrity, it, for example, allows the executive director to be able to feel comfortable coming to the board saying, in 3 years, I'm thinking about retiring. Let's start talking about a succession plan. Or I really screwed up on this decision. I need to tell you about this. This is what I'm doing to fix it. Or we're having financial issues, but this is what I'm going to do to fix it. If you don't have that trust and integrity, oftentimes the important conversations, the elephants in the room, don't get put on the table. So now I know I am running over, Rahima, as I just looked at my watch. So real quickly on the next one, if there's one thing to take away from this conversation today is to proactively address the elephants in the room. They may be small elephants, they may be big elephants. You may need an outsider to come in to help you address them. You may be able to do it yourself. But in order to continue to allow governance to be a competitive advantage, it's important that we proactively do that. And then last, but certainly not least, I truly believe that as Christians, we have a unique advantage. It's our faith that allows us to bring our faith to the table, to make decisions that are for the common good as opposed to our personal self-interest. I don't know if any of you are Succession fans on HBO Max, but that's a great example of how boards should not work. It's a great example of people not bringing their faith to the table. The other interesting quick story about the book that's coming out, I decided to write this from a secular perspective. And the more I'm getting into this, and I'm almost 90% done, I'm realizing that's impossible because I think each of all of us are called and have this unique calling that allows us to pursue our vocation by bringing our faith to the table. And it's a huge benefit that each and every one of us has as Christians. So with that, Rahima, I am going to take a breath and
yes,
questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Kurt. We're going to let you take a breath, and I want to give us a few minutes to put in some questions that we might have in the chat. We do have a few minutes for that. While you take your breath, let's hear a word from LCEF.
Hello, everyone. My name is Blake Brown, Assistant Vice President of National Lending Solutions at the Lutheran Church Extension Fund.
And my name is Dan Brown, Vice President of National Lending Solutions at Lutheran Church Extension Fund.
On behalf of our organization, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. LCEF is thankful for the opportunity to partner with the LCMS RSO office and provide this resource to all of you. We pray that it's a blessing to you and the work that you're doing through your organization. LCEF has been exceptionally busy over the past year as we work to support the ministries of many RSOs, congregations, and schools such as yours. We know that there have been many unique challenges over the past several years, and in the midst of it all, God is good. We want you to know that we're here to support you any way we can.
We are here to support you through low-cost loans, credit lines, or other opportunities for growth in your ministry. We work with both large and small ministries across the U.S. As part of the LCMS for over 40 years, we understand you like no other lender. We invite you to reach out by email or phone. We would love to connect with you about your ministry and see how LCF can support. You will receive a follow-up email after the webinar, and our contact information will be included.
Again, thank you for watching this webinar, and we continue to pray for you and your ministry. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
Again, thank you so much, Kurt, for the words that you've shared. There is so much information, and I know you started it off by saying this conversation could go on for hours, and hopefully this is a tool to continue conversation, to connect people with one another, and to be a resource to those who are listening now and in the future. There were a couple of questions that came through, several of them around this same topic. So I'll start with this question. Could you speak a little bit to term limits, recommendations or best practices for term limits, and should there be a difference between the term limit for a board member and the chair of a board member?
Yeah. Again, this is the art of governance, right? And so I'm not sure there's one answer for every single board, but my perspective from a best governance practice is that term limits are useful. I think there's real value to having turnover on boards of directors in terms of getting differences of opinions. I think the magic number, and this is just me, is 9 years. So 3 terms of 3 years. 9 is enough to get really understanding the organization, but not too long. I also think, especially with bringing in more diverse and maybe board members who've not had board experience before, I think board mentoring is a great idea, that you assign a new board member to a different board, a more experienced board member. We've been doing this in organizations for the first time. I also, and there are differences of opinions on this, but I actually think there's value to having a separate term limit for board chairs. I like to say 3 years, but it could be anywhere from 3 to 4, 2 to 4. But I've seen organizations where it's the same chairman, and it's usually a man, for literally a decade, 15 years, and it's not good governance. All sorts of unintentional bad things can happen because of that. So I think there's value to changing that over. I also don't think once the chair is sometimes it's weird to have the board chair there, especially for more than a year. I would probably, if I were the organization, not necessarily have former board chairs continue to sit on the board. And I also don't think it matters if it's, I saw the other question, Rahima.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I really don't think it matters. 99% of your votes are not going to come to a split vote. And if you have a split vote where it's 8-8, something else is going on. And so maybe you need to take a step back and figure it out anyway. So it does not matter to me whether it's out or in.
Okay. And you actually touched on another question that Patrick asked on mentoring. Could you just maybe dive in a little bit deeper on how do you set up that board mentoring? Do you do it within the same board, or do you actually partner them with maybe another board for another organization that's similar?
Yeah, it's a great question. So typically what we've done is within the same board had a mentor. But we've also then sent board members to various different seminars to help them become better board members. And then the other piece that I didn't mention in the seminar because we just didn't have enough time, but I'm a big believer that every CEO needs to have a mentor. Now, it may be an official one, it may be a coach. I actually had a board chair one time who was a combination coach, therapist, friend, advisor, hit me with a stick every once in a while, but I respected him so much that he was right. And so it's really important for an executive director to have some sort of individual or people that they can turn to, whether it's a paid coach or volunteers or friends or whatever, who understand the CEO role, because it can be oftentimes a very lonely position. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And that idea of coaching has just been growing exponentially. I was recently at the Lutheran Services in America conference, which LCF is a partner with, and to hear that being echoed by a lot of CEOs and executive directors of organizations, that they've really had to seek out a coach that fits with them and that can mentor them, has just been key and pivotal as they lead their organization. So I really appreciate you reiterating that for us here today. Dorothy actually asked a question, and so I want to bring that up because, as you know, Dorothy, as the director of the LCMS RSO offices, is often called upon and is trying to provide resources, which is why we have this webinar. But she asked, could you speak a little to onboarding your new board members? What are maybe your top 2 or 3 recommendations to onboard a new board member to your organization?
Yeah, first of all, I think you have to be very intentional about this. And I would suggest that not only is it the CEO, but it's probably several senior staff members that, so the new board member gets to know all of the senior staff, as well as a board chair or the board chair and a governance committee chair, so that they can get a perspective from both the board perspective as well as from the staff perspective. The other best practice that I've seen, and we started doing this at the end at Upbring, is having the board orientation at one of our facility sites, at one of our program sites, so that not only do we talk about the nuts and bolts and finances and all the stuff that people tend to forget after a couple of hours, but you see firsthand the difference that you're making, and you can walk through the community and talk about the different issues and opportunities, so they can do a little bit deeper dive within a specific program. I think that's really important as well.
Thank you so much. I want to be mindful of our time together, and so we'll call that our last question. But I know that hopefully this has sparked a lot more conversation. And with that in mind, I want to remind you that this is just the first part of our series. You can join us next week, where we will actually take Kurt's words and hear from other CEOs as we have a panelist that will be speaking to us, involving 2 executive directors and one of LCF's Ministry Solutions, Tim Kurth, who works with RSOs and their board governance as well. So we'll be continuing this conversation next week. But Kurt, thank you so much for your words of wisdom. I want to remind our listeners that this is being recorded, and so you will receive an email next week after both webinars are completed with links to view these, and we want to encourage you to share them with those on your board and within your organization. So on behalf of all of us at LCEF and in partner with the LCMS RSO office, thank you again. God's blessings to you and your ministry.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.